Welcome once again to the Mind, Technology, and Society Speaker Series. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jonathon Gratch, who is a research professor of computer science and psychology. There's so much to say, I don't want to make sure I don't get it wrong. Because not only is he an interdisciplinary researcher in both CS and psychology, he happens to be the director for virtual human research at USC's Institute for Creative Technologies, the co-director of the USC Computational Emotion Group, and the editor-in-chief of IEEE's Transactions on Effective Computing. Oh, we got to update that. But you know, once it's kind of like a president or senator, right? And Dr. Gratch's many interests sort of primarily include effective computing, cognitive modeling, human-computer interaction, virtual humans, persuasive technology, and all things Black Mirror. And so if you're a student, please make sure to sign in. If you attended the lunch, please make sure to sign that one as well. It should be going around. Otherwise, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Gratch.
No, thank you for having me. So who in the room is a technologist? Minority. Psychologist? Other? I'm going to kind of talk about sort of psychology of technology in this talk. And I'm guessing many of you don't know what the media equation is. I'll talk about that in a couple slides. But in general, I'm going to talk about to what extent do people treat machines as if they're social entities. And in particular, should we make machines that are human-like? And do people treat them, if they're human-like, do they treat machines as if they're interacting with a person? What does that actually mean? Do they treat them differently? Would they treat them more like a person if they had human-like characteristics? What do these changes tell us about human social cognition? And ultimately, how can we use what we learned from these kind of questions to build machines that better interact with people and help us achieve our goals? For those who don't know what the media equation is, this is most known by the Nass and Reeves and Cliff Nass at Stanford came out with this book many years ago. And Cliff Nass is sort of more associated with this idea of, do people treat machines as social actors? And so the idea is that if you look at social psychology and people interacting with other people, people do funny things to each other that they wouldn't necessarily do if they're interacting with the environment. And so they engage in various kinds of biases, but also do various kinds of follow various social rules and infer things from a social perspective. And what Cliff Nass argued was that just take out one of these people, replace it with a computer, and you'll see the same thing. So the media equation argues there's some kind of equality between how people treat other people and how people treat computers. And so let me give an example. Well, first let me just say, why do I care? And so, as Colin mentioned, I'm at a place called Institute for Creative Technologies. It's a big research center associated with USC. And part of what we do is build things that are like people. And so this is one project quite a few years ago we're involved in, which is essentially Westworld. So you could talk to virtual characters and shoot them and they shoot back. This is a project of a colleague of mine where the idea is to capture the memories of a Holocaust survivor and then create a virtual character that you can ask them about their memories. And even after they've passed on, their memories are preserved. And I'll talk a little bit about this system. It's an agent that can interview people about their mental health. Probably won't talk about this one so much, but you can also imagine using these characters to teach social skills. In this case, it's a character that you can practice negotiation with. And the mission of ICT is to use this technology to teach. And the idea is to put people in virtual environments that are so real that they act as though they're in the real place. And when it's a social environment, that they act as though they're interacting with a real person. So create simulations that are so compelling that people act as if it's real. Now, I became interested in the media equation because essentially Cliff Nass is arguing that the way you can tell if something is in some sense social is to see if people engage in social behaviors from it. And so the idea is, if we see some effect or some behavior people do towards other people, will they show that same behavior when they're interacting with a virtual person? So give me a couple examples of what that might mean. So one thing that people do in social contexts is this idea called code switching. And so I grew up in Texas. I don't have much of an accent, but when I go back to Texas, my wife always comments that I start talking in my Texas accent. She hates it. So that's an example of code switching, where when you're in a certain context where you're presented with cues, you flip not just your behavior, but also some of your cognition to be more congruent with that culture you're in at the moment. And so one of the things we're interested in is, would virtual humans evoke this kind of code switching in people that come from two different cultures? And so to test that, what we did is we had people go onto some online survey, and they had this virtual character that was somewhat racially ambiguous explain the survey to them. And so it would say something like,
"Hello, and thank you for making time to participate in this study."
Or some people would see this one.
"Hello, and thank you for making time to participate in this study."
And so you probably noticed the difference is accent. So we looked at American accented English and Chinese accented English, different examples of it. And then we had people do this particular task, which is known as the fish task. And so the fish task is a way to measure collectivist versus individualistic orientation. Generally speaking, you say, look at this image and say, is this fish here leading the other fish, or is it being chased? And what you typically will see when people do this task is people from an individualist culture, like America, will say this fish is leading, and people from a more collectivist culture, like China, would say this fish is being chased. And so what we did is had the same task, but we presented people who were either Native Americans or Chinese bicultural Americans with this task, and with the two different accented voices. And what we'd see is that Chinese Americans that heard the Chinese accented voice would act more collectivistically. They would say the fish is being chased, where if they heard the American accented voice, they'd act more individualistically. They'd say the fish is being leading. And Americans actually showed the kind of the reverse pattern. So it's kind of interesting, but it's basically showing that just the accent of this character can push around the social effect that's observed in people. Here's another example. So another very common social effect that happens in people is something called in-group favoritism. So we like people who are from our group, we do nice things for them, we don't like people from a different group as much, and we're less likely to do nice things for them. And one indicator of group is race. And so the question becomes, do people attend to the race of this virtual human, and does that influence their behavior? And so here's a very simple task. We can explore this in something called the Dictator game. The idea is that the scientist gives $20 to one person, and that person is free to give as much as they want to the other person. So they can give, say, $5 to the other person, and then that person has to accept that offer. Okay, so you're free to give 0 if you want. People often don't give 0, they give something more than 0. But then we looked at people playing this game online with another entity, and we told them you're playing with this virtual character, and we just happened to change the visual appearance of this virtual character. And so it either had a race that matched you or mismatched you, depending on what you are. And then we measured the allocation the person gave to the other. And what you see is that just by manipulating the appearance of this computer program, people would give more money to a character of the same race as them than they would do to another race. So again, this is a social effect. This is something you observe in people, and now people are doing this to a virtual person. And so you could argue in some sense that the media equation holds, that we have this effect between people and group favoritism, and we can show that it equals the effect we see with virtual humans. But actually, not exactly. So I didn't really show you equality. I showed the effect occurs, but I didn't actually show you the effect is equal. And so one of the things we actually did in the study is we didn't just manipulate the race of the character, we also manipulated people's belief as to who they were playing against. And so half the people were told, hey, you're playing with another person in the other room, and they self-selected this avatar to represent their race. Or we told them, hey, you're playing a computer program. And what you find from that manipulation is, in fact, people give more money to humans than to machines. Perhaps not surprising, what does a machine need money for? But we find this effect robustly across a number of tasks. And so not just in economic games, but in clinical interviews and some financial disclosure negotiation, various different kinds of tasks, we see this general effect where the social effect that we're observing that people are applying to a computer is in fact much weaker than if they're told that the thing that they're interacting with is a person. And so one way to kind of think of this is a mean equation is not inequality, but it's really inequality such that if you observe, pick some arbitrary social effect that you see between people, and it'll be stronger if they think they're playing another person than they think they're playing a computer, but it's still greater than 0. Question?
Sorry, just a quick clarification question. You said that they gave more to the humans than the computers?
Yes.
I thought the chart was saying the opposite. Sorry.
Did I?
The agents are getting a smaller offer percent than the avatars, right?
This is.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
This is the percent of their stuff. I think this is how much are they keeping, no, how much are they offering for themselves? So they're making they're giving a quarter of their money to a person here. In this case, they're giving more like 20% of their money. So it's not a huge effect in this particular study, but they are being more generous.
Yeah, I just made a mistake.
Yeah, no problem. I often make errors, so you get it right. So broadly speaking, what we and others have found is that yes, this idea that people treat computers as social actors is to some extent true, and has been observed across a number of effects, but it's more like they treat computers a little bit like people. And you'll often see this fairly large gap between the strength of the effect, in this case an offer you make to someone else, towards a person or towards a computer. And so going back to the mission of our institute, we want to create simulations that are so compelling that people treat them as if they're real. What we're actually finding is people treat them as if they're a little bit real. We're in the direction of reality, but we're not there. And so we can actually use this kind of empirical data as like a measuring stick. And so then maybe, what if we make it a more human-like machine? Would that make people cooperate more than if it was a less human-like machine? And then we can measure, in some sense, the difference between the strength of the social effect with other people versus the strength of the social effect they think they're playing a computer, and see if we can narrow the gap. Is there a question? No. Okay. So that's the game. One of the games I'm trying to play in our lab is have all these knobs we can play with. What does it look like? What do you believe about it? Do you believe you're playing a person or a computer? We can look at individual differences, situational factors, manipulate all these things, pick your favorite social effect, and measure the strength of that social effect and see, are we getting people to respond to a computer as if it's a person? And then the question is there a theoretical mechanism from the psychological perspective about human cognition that would explain why people would treat different traits or appearances differently? And so one of the things we've been looking at a lot is a particular psychological theory called mind perception theory. And the argument is basically that when you're interacting with another, you form some kind of folk theory about what that other can do, and that folk theory informs the way you treat them. And mind perception theory, there's many of these kind of theories. Mind perception theory in particular argues that if you do factor analysis, you can see that roughly we categorize other minds in terms of two broad dimensions called agency or intelligence versus experience/emotion. And the way to think of this is that people, we typically assign agency, free will, intelligence to, and we think they feel emotion. Animals we're less willing to assign intelligence, agency to, but we still think they feel emotion. Standard computer probably has neither, but these newfangled AI things typically will come in and say, okay, it's got agency, intelligence, but it doesn't feel anything. And this has consequences for behavior. So generally speaking, as things become more intelligent and possess more free will, we hold them more accountable for their actions. And so imagine I'm playing a Dictator game with a robot and it's deciding how much money to offer, and it screws me over, then if it's just a machine, I might not get pissed off. It's just a machine. But if I knew it's a super smart machine and it intentionally screwed me over, I might get kind of mad at that machine. Experience dimension, you can kind of think of this as the more something feels emotion, the more we feel the obligation to protect it from harm. And so if now we're playing this Dictator game with a dog, and we're going to decide how many dog biscuits to divide between myself and the dog, I might feel bad about the dog looking at me and knowing it's going to feel emotion if I don't give it any and I eat all the biscuits myself. Whereas if it's just a machine, I don't think it deserves any protection from harm, and so I might actually enjoy smashing the machine with a baseball bat and not feel bad about that. In fact, if you go to Korea, you can go to these places where you can do that for fun. Okay, so what that suggests is that I should be able to manipulate people's behavior towards machines by pushing around their beliefs about the mind. And so if you imagine we're playing some kind of game with a robot here, and I tell you, hey, this robot is controlled by an AI, you'll probably treat it less socially. On the other hand, if I tell you, exact same robot, exact same behavior, but by the way, there's a person in the other room that's playing this robot and they get all the material awards this robot gets, you might start to treat it more socially. But now let's say I add behaviors to this robot that conveys that this robot feels emotion, feels pain. Then arguably people will ascribe more human-like mind to it and start treating it in a more social way. Alternatively, if I told you, hey, this person, they completed this personality questionnaire and they're just like Spock, they don't feel anything. You might imagine then that people will treat that person in some ways more like a machine. It's sometimes called the mechanistic dehumanization. So we try to manipulate that. So we had people play an ultimatum game with another, in this case I think they were all white male characters, and they were told either the behavior of this thing is controlled by a person in the other room, or hey, the behavior of this thing is controlled by an AI that's programmed. And then we either did or didn't have that character show emotion. So if you were screwed the machine over, it would look angry. If you gave a fair allocation, the machine would look happy. And what we find is a main effect of this belief. So people, if they think they're playing a human, they give more fair offers to that human. However, that effect completely goes away if you control for emotion. So people give the emotional AI the same allocation as if they were actually playing a person. Okay, so that's an example of how we can use mind perception theory to try to manipulate people's perceptions of the capacity of this other, and that turns out to influence their behavior. And it also suggests that emotion is a particularly important factor to get people to treat machines, AI machines, more human-like, because they already ascribe agency to machines nowadays. You can describe it as an AI. Okay. So up to this point, I kind of talked about we can make a machine that is more human-like and reduce this gap between how people tend to treat machines and how they tend to treat people. But is this a good thing? Do we always want to make people treat machines like other people? And if you look at this list, some of these things are not so nice, right? So do we want to trigger racist behavior towards machines? Do we want to have people, impression management is that basically when I'm talking to someone else, I lie about myself to make me seem smarter or nicer than I really am. Do we want people to lie to machines? I don't know. These are things that we can do. Is it a good idea? So let me talk about one project I've been involved with a number of years where we actually find benefits that result from people treating machines differently than people. And in this case, we're trying to get at this problem in mental health, which is that in mental illness, people don't want to disclose their weakness to another person. And so one of the big challenges in treatment is people have to you have to find out they have symptoms, but to get the symptoms they have to disclose. And there's a lot of undiagnosed mental illness because people won't go into for treatment, or if they do go into treatment, they won't disclose their symptoms. And so could you use technology in some ways to get people to disclose more about mental health by taking advantage of the fact that they treat computers somehow differently than people? So, as I mentioned, to treat mental illness, we need to get them to disclose symptoms. And if you look at the literature on disclosure, there's basically two broad pathways by which we can get people to disclose stigmatized information about themselves to another. One is through this idea of rapport, sometimes called therapeutic alliance, where if I establish a relationship with a person, if I engage in good active listening behaviors, I can draw them out, make them feel comfortable, and talk more. Another pathway is through anonymity. So people don't feel like they're actually talking to another person. Maybe they're just talking to a machine, filling out a standard web form, which they've been assured is private. There's research that suggests that they'll talk more if it's in this anonymous machine rather than another person. And so what we're interested in this project is somehow could we combine these both pathways? So could we, in some sense, get a machine that would establish rapport with people, yet still make them feel like they're anonymous and not being evaluated, and therefore get both of these pathways towards self-disclosure. Okay, so first, rapport. How do you get a machine to establish rapport with the person? So to do this, we looked a lot at the literature on how people establish rapport with other people. And we were influenced heavily by the work of Bob Rosenthal and his student Tickle Dingen, that they argued that rapport gets established when you interact with another person if they're attentive, if they're showing positive emotions, and in some sense they're coordinated or syncing up with your behaviors. And so you feel like you have some kind of connection. And if you can establish this idea of rapport, it's correlated with socially desirable behaviors like liking, engagement, but also more disclosure. Now, the way we actually tried to get machines that could create some notion of rapport with people is we took a data-driven machine learning approach. We brought lots of people into the laboratory and had them talk, and some of them were good at making a connection and establishing a link, and some not so good. And so we basically used that as data. We took these various interviews. One person basically saw a story, and we're telling a story to another person. We had some subjective measures, so both parties would report whether they felt rapport. We had third-party coders also rate them. But more importantly, we were able to use various computer science techniques to, say, track facial expressions, look at posture, analyze the tone of the speech, and do that on both sides of the conversation. So we had this person talking, we had the person on the other side that was listening, and the idea is, could we learn a model that would predict what the listener does in response to what the speaker is doing that creates some sort of sense of rapport. So let me give an example of what this kind of looks like. So really what this algorithm is going to do is learn how to be a passive but listener, but conveying that I'm interested and attentive to what you're doing. And so this is, my PhD student did a lot of this work, Li-Xing Huang. And actually, he just, because we didn't have a lot of money at the time, just grabbed the bartender from our Westworld application. So this guy looks a little gruff. But what you'll see is this character going through a list of questions, but then as he answers each question, tries to convey that he's interested and attentive.
Favorite things to do in your free time?
My favorite things to do in my free time is I like playing ping pong. I like playing soccer, and I like playing video games. That's it.
What characteristics about yourself are you most proud of?
I think I am pretty honest. I'm an easygoing person, and I think I'm working very hard.
Okay. So kind of a toy, but it's also a nice experimental paradigm. And so we did a lot of research bringing people in, talking to this character, and they either believed it was an AI or it was a person, and we can systematically manipulate different aspects of these behaviors. In particular, I mentioned that Tickleding and Rosenthal argued that you need positivity, mutual gaze, and this kind of coordination, and we could systematically knock out those different theoretically positive factors and show that as you knock them out, you see less disclosure and people feel subjectively less rapport with this agent. So in some sense, we have kind of captured some of the factors that make people feel attentive, but more importantly, it gets people to disclose more information if this character is listened to them. So it's good at drawing people out. So that's the toy, but that's the background behind this character, which is a bit more sophisticated system, which is trying to interview people about their mental health and see if it can draw them out and have them disclose more information. And what you're seeing, here's the character, and then you're seeing overlaid this, what the character can see about the other person. So you're seeing kind of, if you've seen the movie Terminator, he has all this stuff. This is the Terminator view of this character.
Hey, I'm Ellie. Thanks for coming in today. I was created to talk to people in a safe and secure environment. I'm not a therapist, but I'm here to learn about people and would love to learn about you. I'll ask a few questions to get us started. And please feel free to tell me anything. Your answers are totally confidential. Are you okay with this?
Yes.
So, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
That's good. Where are you from originally?
I'm from Los Angeles.
Oh, I'm from LA myself.
Okay, so what you're seeing here is this character is doing facial expression tracking. It's actually analyzing the affect in the audio signal. It's looking at posture. It's recognizing the speech, and then we can do things like sentiment analysis on the text, infer the person saying things positive or negative. And then it's doing this kind of contingent rapport behavior that we learned from the previous study to try to get people to talk more. Okay, so that's the basic system. So the first question is, do people actually disclose more to this thing if they think it's an AI versus if they think there's a person in the other room actually that's controlling this character? And so, like before, we showed that certain effects are stronger if you think there's a person in the other room. In this case, the effect we're worried about is impression management. So people, do they feel that they're being negatively evaluated in this interview potentially, therefore they don't want to disclose intimate information about themselves. And so people came in to the study and randomized. They either were told, hey, this is an AI, this is kind of how it works, it's analyzing your face and voice, and it uses this to drive the responses. Or, hey, there's a dude in the other room, and he's pushing buttons, and that's what's leading the character to do its behavior. So that's manipulating the belief. Now, we also actually independently manipulated whether it really was an AI or not. So one factor was what people were told. The other factor was it really an AI? Or was there a person in the other room that was controlling the system? Okay. Brought a bunch of people in. We tried to, well, first we had measures of people's PTSD and depression using some clinical instruments. And then we had people at the end of the study report how much they felt they disclosed subjectively. We also had a measure called fear of negative evaluation. Did they feel like they were being judged during the interaction? And then we had human coders come in and independently rate the transcriptions of what people said for how intimate their disclosure was. And we also looked at facial expressions, yeah.
Okay, so there's one dimension of what the subject is being told, whether it's being told whether it's a computer or a human.
Yes.
And then there's another one for like what's actually controlling it. So there are some conditions where you lied to.
Yes, there's deception in here. Yes. Okay. So some people were told this is a person, but it's an AI. Some people were told this is an AI, but it's a person, and some people were told the truth. Yeah. And we also asked how well did the interaction go? Did they think the character understood them and worked properly? Let me give an example of what the coders did. So this would have been coded as, and this is actually a veteran. Most of the subject pool is veterans. And he's talking about a little incident when he was in Iraq. And this would be coded as highly intimate.
Boxes of candy. You could just call me the candy man. I bring like 6 or 7 boxes just full of candy. And it's really hard to know to see kids with their arms cut off or their foot missing and stuff, you know. But you know, that's the way life is, you know, but it's all better now.
Okay. So obviously revealing fairly intimate stuff. What we found was that actually what it really was, whether it was an AI or a person, didn't have any effect on disclosure. What we found is a main effect of belief. So people believe they're talking to an AI, then they disclose more intimate stuff to the system. They reported less fear of being judged during the interview. And we actually saw for people that reported negative affect, they showed more negative affect on their face. And so it's as if they were not masking their true emotions during the interview. We did find an effect of the algorithm. People thought that the one that was controlled by AI, the interaction didn't work as well, which is true. So people are picking up on the differences in the two techniques, but that didn't seem to matter in terms of disclosure. Yeah.
Just real quick, did you guys assess afterwards if they caught on when it was an AI or not?
Yeah, we probed for suspicion, and I think we excluded. There's some percentage, I think, in these reports we exclude people who suspected manipulation.
Oh, okay.
Just some anecdotes. People actually, I was a little worried that people would accept this, but a lot of people actually liked talking to a machine. They reported that, yeah.
Just a clarification, when you frame it that they're talking to an AI, you also explain that this AI was built through in part through human data?
No, we didn't mention that. We just described it as how it kind of works, but we didn't frame. In some of the other studies, though, what we have done is said that this AI is programmed to act like a person. And it still seems to have effect as long. And what's also really odd, I'll get back to this in a little bit, is that everyone knew, and they signed consent forms, and in many cases they opt to allow you guys to see their videos. And so they knew at some point in time some human was going to look at this interaction. But what seems to actually matter is, are they being evaluated in the moment by a person? So that comes up in some of our studies. And so it's not that people are being quote unquote rational. They at some level know they're being evaluated and judged, but the idea of them being evaluated and judged in the moment by a person is what seems to be driving it. So in some sense we can show that we're not evoking these pressure management concerns by framing it as a computer program, and that gets people to talk more. The other thing we wanted to look at, though, is does adding these kind of nonverbal rapport behaviors actually benefit the interaction? And so in the second study, what we did is we went in with a group of National Guard unit from Colorado that had just returned from Afghanistan, and we had them interact with the system. This is within subject design. We had them fill out the standard form they're required to do for the military that tries to assess PTSD. And then we had them do both an anonymous version of that form and one that goes to their supervisors, because previous studies had shown people reveal more to the anonymous form. And then we told them they're going to have this anonymous interview with this character, and that character asks several of the questions from this same form. And we wanted to see, could we get more disclosure by talking to this character? And so as I mentioned, this Colorado National Guard unit. This unit was actually a special forces unit, and they experienced some pretty bad stuff. And so they fill out this what's called post-deployment health questionnaire, asked things about alcohol, asked if you had any bad memories that arose from that situation. And then we did, as I mentioned, the official one, the anonymized version, and the virtual interviewer within subject design. What we find is that people disclose twice as much information to the agent than they did to the on these forms, both the anonymous and the one that was supervised. There was no actual effect here that we observed. And anecdotally, we think what's happening is by having a conversation, it's drawing out more information than you would normally just kind of put on a form. And so let me give you an example of one of these disclosures. So this is a soldier. She was actually in a convoy where the vehicle in front of her hit an IED, killed the people in the vehicle in front of her. Her vehicle caught fire and flipped over. And so the agent is probing whether she had any bad memories from this incident. So this is, the audio is a little bad, but there's a transcript so you can see what she's talking about.
Tell me about any bad dreams you had about your experiences, or times when you thought...
So this person actually, on her form report, she had no bad dreams. The character asked him, did she have any bad dreams? And we're not seeing anything. Okay. Hold on a second, I have to drag this over here. Yes. There it is.
Thinking I'm dying, yes.
Hopefully you can hear
Thinking I'm on fire, sure. Thinking I didn't get out of my vehicle, yep. Thinking that I left a guy stuck in a vehicle, yep. Oh, I can't do this. What? Feeling stuck on the X, yep. What? Thinking that, you know, more fuckers are going to come out of the crowd, sure. I've had every fucking dream there is to have, so. But they're just dreams, so. I mean, I'm thankful for that because it didn't happen, right? Got blown up, got out the vehicle, fine, I'm safe, nobody died, nobody lost a limb, nobody was gravely injured. I'm here to tell the story, so I'm thankful for that. So, they're, you know, those are all the positives. So dreams are just dreams. You wake up and, you know, you push that shit out of your head. You go on with your life.
How much of a problem has this been for you?
It's not a problem. It's just it's life.
So you actually, you may have noticed both of those veterans, they said all this horrible things happened, but that's not a problem. So that's very common in this particular population, and it's probably why they often don't report these symptoms, because the story they're telling themselves is that it's not an issue, but when you have an interview with them, you might suspect there might be an issue. We've been doing this on other domains. Won't really talk about this too much, but for example, we do a lot of work in these negotiation systems, and we find that people, in general, when you teach negotiation, it's an unpleasant activity. You don't like to be confrontational with another person, but in some cases you have to do that to learn the various tactics, and we find people feel much more comfortable interacting with these kind of agents and trying out these sort of socially risky tactics, and that has certain benefits, I think, for teaching. Okay, so just to kind of summarize up to now, what we talked about is that some social effects are beneficial for computers to evoke, like rapport, but some are harmful, like impression management. And these effects can be altered in different ways, and we don't have mapped the whole space out, but there are ways to try to push these effects around, and really what I think is we want something that's not human-like, we want something in some sense that's superhuman-like, so it gets the benefits of having this kind of virtual environment, so maybe you can do things that a person can't do even better. And you know, maybe actually, in retrospect, if we made that character less human-like, maybe that would have had a stronger effect than what we're observing right now, because she's fairly empathetic. The other thing that emphasizes what this results show is it's actually just mere belief about what the other's mind is pushing a lot of these effects around. And so, and like I said before, it didn't matter whether it was really an AI or a person, it's whether your belief about it's an AI or a person influences it. And it's also kind of funny because if you think of a computer, let's say we're playing a game with a ultimatum game with a computer, like, you know, you don't, what does that mean to play? At some level, there's always a person back there, right? So someone made the machine, and when we're running these experiments, somebody's getting the money. So we're playing these economic games, I'm getting the money if they don't win it. It goes back to my grant. And so there's always a person there. It's what is that person or an organization. It's just they're not necessarily salient. And so a lot of times when we're interacting, talking about having a human interact with an autonomous agent, one way to think of agents is, the term actually comes from humans. So we have an agent that does things, a real estate agent does something on my behalf. And so, you know, until the Terminator takes over and the robots rule the world, there's always going to be a person there somewhere. So if you're interacting with an agent like Ask Jen at Alaska Airlines or some agent at a bank teller, there's a person there, you know, marketing manager somewhere that decided how this thing is going to behave. And so really, we're always in this kind of space where if we're interacting with an agent, there's a person on both sides of this equation. And so this, we've been starting to call this term autonomous representatives, and we're interested in how do people interact with machines when you manipulate how salient the other is. And so, for example, we've shown people are less fair to machine, but what if we make the fact that this machine is doing these actions on behalf of another person more salient? Will that influence the way you interact with it? And on the flip side, imagine that you're programming your agent to go off and interact with other people. Are you going to program it the same way as you yourself would act if you're interacting with that person? So the last part of my talk, I want to kind of unpack some of that work. And so first, let's look at, you know, interacting with someone's agent. And so we could manipulate, say we're playing an ultimatum game or dictator game with this other entity, and we know generally how much people share with another person. You know, what if we have them play with a machine that represents a person? We describe it in this way. Or what if we just describe it as a machine that represents me as an experimenter? Or what if we say, we leave off the person part, hey, you're interacting with a machine. Or maybe we tell them, hey, you know, throw this money in the trash. What you can show experimentally is that as we, in some sense, decrease the salience and similarity of the other to you, you find that people are less generous to the other. They keep more stuff for themselves. So they're less fair to the other as we make the salience of the person behind them more distant. The flip side of that is we could ask, well, what if you're programming this machine to interact with other people? That should also kind of increase this distance and make us feel less like that other person. There's been work by what's called bounded ethicality by Bazerman that shows that as you increase the distance between your agent and you, you'll be more willing to do bad things to the other party. And so we wanted to look at this side of the equation and say, well, what if we give people the ability to program this agent to play the game on their behalf? How will they program it? So in the ultimatum game, you have to decide, okay, when I get offers, when I make an offer, how generous should the offer be? When I get an offer from somebody else, you know, should I accept or reject that offer? So we have people program their agent to act on their behalf, and then the agent goes off and plays with another person. And what we initially expected is people would be less generous when they're programming their computer to interact with someone else because they're more distant from the other. So it should reduce other concerns, like things like cooperation. Actually, what we found experimentally is the opposite, that people program their machines to, in some sense, be nicer than they themselves are when they interact in tasks. And in general, they seem to have more regard for certain norms like fairness when they're programming these machines. And we've replicated that in a wide variety of tasks. We've had people, you know, in this case, it was like, should they use their air conditioning or not when they're doing a self-driving car? You can ask me, I don't have time to go through the details, but we've tried to unpack why this is, and it seems that what's happening here is when you program a task ahead of time, it makes the immediate rewards less salient. So in some sense, you act in a more idealized way than you would be if you're in the task in the moment. You kind of think of like when you program your exercise app, how hard you want to exercise, you're probably a lot tougher on yourself ahead of time than when your app's telling you to work out and your exercise. So in some sense, it seems like when people are programming these entities to act on their behalf, they look at all the actions in the moment, and they're more less focused on the sort of immediate momentary reward. It's something that will come out shortly in MTS. So to kind of finally summarize, what I tried to say in this talk is that people treat machines as if they're people, but only a little bit. And that this can be enhanced by adding some human-like traits to these machines, particularly traits associated with emotion. And this is consistent with at least this sort of folk theory, mind perception theory. People form a theory of the other's mind that has certain kind of capacities, and based on those inferences or beliefs, that changes their behavior. But we don't always want to make people treat machines like people. And in some cases, and I gave an example of, in the context of the disclosure, by being more of a machine, people feel less evaluated, and therefore they're more willing to disclose. And that can be good in the context of mental health. Now, we've also shown in a financial advisor situation, people are more willing to disclose to some random bot over the internet than they are if they think they're talking to a person. So you can extract more sensitive financial data from people, so maybe that's not a good thing. But there's really always a human mind behind these machines, and in some sense, those beliefs about that mind are also driving this interaction, and the extent we can make that other more or less salient can also influence the way people interact with these artifacts. And so that's all I had today, and this is my research group, and I'm happy to answer questions.
We have an ancient custom that the students go first.
All right.
You want to do it from?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, great talk. It's really interesting how one's perception of the humanness or non-humanness of the agents in our environment can drastically change how we interact with them. I'm kind of curious about your last point, though, with regards to having agents as representatives. It seems to me that there's also the potential that people feel that as an extension of their will or desires, that might be evaluated as a reflection of them in some respects.
Yes.
So have you considered looking at either probing, asking how attached to this agent do you feel, or how much do you feel that this agent represents you as a potential variable that would change whether or not people actually do act more generously or less generously?
Yeah, so part of this, not yet, but we got a grant this year to start it on this question. Mostly we're looking at it, it's with some collaborators in our business school at Marshall. And so we're mostly looking at it in the context of organizations. But yes, one of the things we're systematically going to manipulate is, does this have, your smiling face, slapped right there on the thing, or is it like, are you framing it more like your assistant, or even maybe you're framing it as their assistant? And one of the fun things you can do with these interactions is often the beliefs are not consistent across all the parties. If you think of something like Amazon Alexa, Amazon does a lot to make you feel like the other is yours. Alexa's yours. You can change your voice and name and all that, and that becomes like your agent, or it's really Amazon's agent. Or in the case of Uber has very sophisticated AI that makes all these kind of decisions, including marketing decisions and pushing messages, but they frame it as it's not autonomous, it's just this service. and they try to make the AI invisible and make you think that this is just a way to interact from person to person, where in fact it's an AI which is connected to a marketing guy that's trying to make various kinds of decisions to maximize the corporate profit. So yeah, we're trying to see how a number of things, including reputation, identity, power, organizational role, as how you frame this thing in terms of those dimensions, how does that influence these processes? Thanks.
Yeah, so for the past couple of years, I've been studying the uncanny valley. Do you think that as these issues you talked about are addressed and resolved, do you think that'll make the uncanny valley sort of less relevant in the long term, or do you think there are aspects of it of the concept that can be applied here?
Yeah, so for those who are not familiar, uncanny valley usually it's a fairly technical effect where in computer animation, if the physical fidelity and the behavioral fidelity of a character mismatch, people are creeped out. And so Japanese androids or the characters in Polar Express was another example, where you see a very realistic face, but the behavior is not right, and so you think this must be a zombie or something like that. And there's been, people have broadened that. There's a paper in, I think, Cognition that showed that just describing, independent of appearance, describing an AI as having emotion might evoke in people a sense of uncanniness. And my sense is, well, so my role in this, we tried to manipulate uncanny valley to some extent in our work, and usually though in our work we put the character in a rich task, so like an economic game or one of these kind of interview tasks, and when we find is when the task is very salient, the morphology of the signals of the appearance of the character doesn't seem to be very much important. It seems much more important the information people extract. And so whether it's a creepy smile or a smiley face or the word smile, it all has the same effect. The fidelity doesn't seem to matter so much. So we personally haven't found, when you're doing a real task with something, that effect to be that important. My guess is that it is very important for very short-term, immediate kind of impression interactions, and my guess is also it's going to depend a lot on people's current schemas of what machines are and how familiar machines are, and as people get more and more familiar with machines, that effect may not be so strong. I think there's some evidence in Japan there's not as much of an uncanny valley effect in the traditional sense with robots as there is in the US.
So yeah, this was a really fun talk, and I had a question about the relationship of the sort of intuitive mind perception work, Gray Wagner citation we had, and how people are treating these machines in terms of things like self-disclosure, any sort of trust behavior. Because there's some work from Peter Hancock that down in Florida that human-animal interactions are actually a very, very useful model for helping to build trust and rapport in robot interactions.
Yeah.
But on that two-dimensional figure you had, animals have very little agency, tons of experience. Automatons have kind of the opposite. And I'm wondering if you developed to design these automatons to look more animalistic, or if the issue isn't so much about agency or even experience, but just the more removed they are from being a human, the more they're willing to trust it because they can't be exploited in the same way that a human could exploit them for disclosure purposes and trust purposes.
So we're mapping what he's doing into our work. I would argue that these animalistic things, what they're doing is they're doing low agency, high experience, which is sometimes viewed as a vulnerable population, and so it's an agent that needs support. And so if your experimental tasks are things that are more about helping the other and forgiving errors on the other, my prediction would be that you would get very powerful effects by having more animal things. It wouldn't necessarily be how you would treat a person, but they may be beneficial for a particular application. Whereas if it's more kind of cold, you might think it's more competent and perhaps trust its decision, if it's making a cognitive decision, better. But then you'd also be less forgiving if it makes mistakes and things like that. So I think he's really also not that inconsistent with this. And in many of these, I mean, I do mind perception theory, but there's about 6 or 7 different of these kind of scales that all basically map down into cognition and emotion. So you got like Susan Fisk's stereotype content model, this Godspeed thing, which is done in AI, kind of has this cognitive and emotional dimensions. There's Haslam's work in humanization. All these things, broadly speaking, argue there's these kind of 2 basic constructs, how much free will and agency and how much does it feel pain, and that can then influence the outcome. So I would argue he's kind of looking at effects that having that kind of character are good at eliciting. If that makes sense. Go down.
Just kind of following Mesh's question about the uncanny valley, one of your earlier slides showed that like people gave the computer less money, and then there was like, what if the computer became more human-like, that they would give it more money?
Yeah.
But if it's like almost human-like, do you think you'd see that kind of like get
That's
money?
creepy. Would you? But my guess, well, I mean, I haven't done that study. I'm not sure if it's been done, but one of the things you would argue is that uncanny valley evokes disgust. And other work in behavioral economics would show that disgust would, trying to think of how that would map on. So Jen Lerner has some interesting stuff where disgust reverses the endowment effect. So I have to think about how that works out. But my guess is it would evoke disgust, and then the question is, what does disgust do to allocations in these kind of economic tasks? And then that would be the answer to your question. Yeah.
Yeah, so it seems, or I guess the way that I understand it, there seems to be sort of like this magic current effect that you're getting from sort of these people that you're interviewing, in which it doesn't seem that they really care, because you try to think of it, should I treat this AI as a human or not? But through this sort of magic current that occurs, I sort of forget what interference I would have with sort of like a human therapist.
Yeah.
All I do is just disclose,
Yeah.
for example, right? But there's also this other dimension of we're trying to think about like the inferences we make, especially with AI, because we have this way of sort of controlling and creating sort of what sort of appearance of what way of implementing them socially. If we're making inferences, where do we draw the line versus do we care whether the person should try to think about this as a human, right? Or should we care whether this AI, knowingly that this is an explicit AI, behaves in a way that we know humans behave?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I'm not, I mean, there's different ways, different aspects of what you're asking. I mean, in some sense, part of the original reason to make things human-like is to try to evoke sort of human folk theories of how to interact. We have these fairly strong theories about how we interact with others, and so in some sense it's an affordance. It tells us what we can do. It's an unfortunate affordance because right now the technology can't be like a person, and so you know, when I try to talk to my car, I don't know what I can say to it. I don't have a good mental model of what kind of things it does or doesn't answer to. And so really from an interaction design thing, you want the form to communicate function. And it's not clear that human-like is the best right now until they have more human-like capacities. But another way to think of your question is from a kind of ethical standpoint, given that we know these things have certain affordances or evoke certain social processes, I can, by design, make you reveal certain things you might not want to reveal if you had thought it through more carefully. And so there's a question about, is that appropriate? Should we build what are the terms of consent for constructing this? So I think in the interview context, it probably may make sense that people should be explained, this has this effect, and do you consent to do this? But if you go on many websites that are trying to persuade you using these kind of what are called social hacks, persuasive technologies, they don't tend to always disclose what it's for. So there's a lot balled up in your question, and I'm not sure how to answer all of it, but it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I guess part of it was, for example, do you think that given that we have some sort of limitations to our technology, right? And then I guess we can do some tricks or whatever, but if we're able to communicate to a person, say like, okay, this is meant to act as a human, given all the data that and we get like access to or information about where the data comes from, do you think that people will be able to make like inferences in a way that it will be more efficient as to try to track them into like, maybe you should behave this way, don't worry about like your areas that you make in trying to learn.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I'm not sure I have a great answer for it. That's a good question. Yeah.
I really liked your talk as a whole, but I have one area of concern, but maybe it's not an actual concern, which was during the therapy session, she was describing how all these bad dreams and so on, and then the AI asks if she thinks this is a problem for her, and she says no, but it clearly is a problem. So what happened next? Did the AI just say, okay, you're right, moving on?
Yeah.
Or was somebody like alerting to this issue, or like what's next?
Yeah. So so one thing also. So I probably wasn't as careful in this talk. I usually make a very careful distinction between therapy and screening or assessment. And I would not recommend this technology for therapy because it doesn't understand a single thing you're saying. Really, I mean, it's getting that information. And then information can be made available to a person, but it really is looking for, can I nod now? Are you done asking a question? Can I ask a follow-up question? And so in terms of the IRB, what we had to do was have a mechanism in place. I mean, this was presented as an experimental study to participants, and the risks were explained. In this case, the only thing we had in there was, and there's always a person in the room monitoring, is if people reveal information that suggests they're suicidal, then there's a protocol that goes into effect, and we had to do that once. But otherwise, yeah, I would say there are attempts, and Facebook has a very public attempt to try to recognize suicidality in posts. There's a lot. I mean, if you know anything about AI, there's a lot of problem in getting machines to make those kinds of assessments. And so nothing happens right now in that case. The technology makes no judgment, and no intervention was done in that particular case. But I think if you want to make a machine that really acts as a therapist, that's a really serious ethical concerns, exactly the one you're raising, that stand as an impediment to trying to roll that stuff out. Which is not to say that people are trying to roll that stuff out, right? But I think there's some real issues with that.
If I can follow up, so if this is being just used as a screening method, I mean, would the participants be told that somebody would eventually be looking at this, or would that have any effect on how much they choose to disclose?
Yeah, so we haven't manipulated that, but we do, what I mentioned earlier, all participants know that people are going to look at this, and so the effect is still happening. The effect seems to be driven by their feelings in the moment. So they all sign, in fact, in this military study, every single participant consented to having their videos shared for research purposes. And so they know that people are watching this stuff. And yet this effect of how you frame it in the moment matters. But I guess also, if one were to think about using this as some kind of therapeutic system, I would try to frame it as essentially like a self-help book. So if you think of like journaling as a standard technique where you go home and you write in your journal, and maybe there's some targeted questions that ask you to reframe it, I would try to frame the system as exactly that. This is something between you and the machine. It's just to help you get the stuff out there, and you need to be aware that no one's looking at this, just you, and then hopefully try to measure if that has some kind of therapeutic benefit.
Okay, thanks.
student questions?
Do you think an environment can affect how we interact with these visual characters? For example, in a visual setup, like in an immersive setup, can it affect how we interact with the visual characters?
You mean, well, so, I mean, you asked two things. One is the environment in general, and the other is does like a virtual versus screen. So there is a fair amount of research that broadly speaking, the environment can shape behavior. So fun study I liked by Jerry Clore, where he had people fill out questionnaires about how much sentencing a criminal should get. And he either had them do it in a standard university cubicle, or he had them go into this trailer with sticky floor, and they filled out with a chewed on pencil. And the people in the quote-unquote disgusting room thought this person should go to jail longer. And so it's easy to show that factors in the environment will shape the decision-making. And there's other work that's looked at like physical robots versus virtual characters versus virtual reality, characters on a screen versus virtual reality. And there are effects, and in my work, I haven't looked at that too much, but I think, as I mentioned before, when people are doing a very clear task that is pretty structured, those effects tend to be weaker. Those different environments afford different notions of interaction. I mean, one very powerful thing in VR is you can do with these characters, you can do proper gaze, where if you're on a screen, particularly if you're in everyone in this room, when I show a character looking at the camera, thinks the character is looking at them. And so you can't do sort of multi-party interaction. So there's a lot of technical things that change in the nature of the interaction, and that all adds up to have differences. There's a lot of stuff in your question, and so really you have to kind of drill down on some aspect of that question to try to get a handle on it. But yes, there are differences.
So we can open the floor to anyone.
Yeah. I want a follow-up question to this idea of screening, and I'm wondering if you guys have looked at being able to maybe describe the question maybe a little better. So the question of bad dreams, like I got the impression that her definition of a bad dream was very different than mine, and I would think that having this AI non-human enough kind of tell me what the definition of a good dream or a bad dream is might help me reframe it so that I could, oh, in that context, maybe I do have bad dreams. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you've looked at that at all.
We have not, but in general, I think the advantage of, the difference between the sort of standard web form where you click, 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 and having a conversation system is you have the opportunity to do more kind of incremental feedback and clarification. And so one of the things, it's kind of a trick the way the character works, but it seems to be one of the more powerful ways of drawing people out is people give a short answer, the character just says, can you tell me more about that? And that seems to get more things. So I think there's advantages of using natural language processing, conversational technology to both do clarification questions and expand on things, to make it more of a dialogue as opposed to when you're in a computer form, you feel like it's cookie cutter, right? And so this affords the opportunity to make a more personalized response where you could do exactly those techniques you're suggesting. Yes.
I'm pondering an explanation that's a little bit more rational for some of the data from the perspective of the subject. So say the subject is really concerned about their role in some social network and the power dynamics of that social network. Then, at least in our society today, computers don't have a lot of power. They don't have much of a role in my social interactions. Even if that program was written by you, now probably a little bit removed from my personal social network. So there's less likelihood that you're going to gossip to my friends or something like that. And the more extended you make it, it seems like there's less and less of a risk to, well, to make it very negative ramifications of me revealing. So do you think that intelligence and experience are somehow intrinsic here, or are they cues? Are they somehow clues to whether or not this is something that would be part of that social network and therefore might have some negative consequences down the road or something?
It was an easier question to answer before your last sentence, but
sorry.
I mean, part of the reason I got interested more in this idea of these representatives, where you have the two people and the machine in the middle, is you can chart to try to manipulate that. So does it matter that this person is a high power, low power, or that you know something about this person or not? So you can start to address your question directly. How it relates to mind perception theory. Mind perception theory is somehow I think it's a very coarse cue. I mean, some of the work we've done, so I mentioned this work on racial categories. In some sense, computerness is kind of like just an outgroup. I mean, in all of these effects, it acts like an outgroup member. Yeah. And so you could see what you're doing with manipulating those dimensions is manipulating its similarity to you. If it has both of these things, it's more like me, so therefore I feel it's more of my tribe or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And if it's different, then it's more kind of out there. So yeah, I guess I would agree with that.
Thank you.
Yes?
Just wondering, have you looked at participants' personality before the study, and whether that impacted how much they disclosed or shared their avatar?
So in general, I've looked more at traits in the economic games, and there one of the big traits that matters a lot is something called social value orientation. How pro-social or individualistic are you? And it seems like individualistic people treat everyone like a computer, and so you don't get an effect of manipulating human versus computer. In terms of the interview stuff, I think the only dispositional stuff we have, in that stuff we just know if they have depression, PTSD, and that doesn't seem to moderate. In some earlier work on the rapport agent, I mean, we saw kind of like what you kind of expect. So people are conscientious, do more stuff. Yeah, but I don't. I can say more in terms of economic games, and there it does seem that people who are naturally social are the ones that are being pushed around the most. They treat people much more differently than they treat machines, and people who are just think about themselves, it doesn't really matter what the other is or what they think. They act the kind of same way. Yeah.
Still on the disclosure topic. So you mentioned that your patients, all the patients, were more likely disclosed to an agent than they were on paper. Were they given the possibility not to say anything? So on paper, if you don't want to answer a question, you leave blank. So when someone asks you a question, you feel more compelled to answer that question because it's rude not to reply. So was there some kind of leeway then not answer the question?
They certainly were told, I think they were told they didn't have to, but I think you're right that, I mean, well, there's two aspects of what you're saying. One is there's just a social, there's this schema that, someone asks a question, you feel obligated to answer. And my guess is a lot of what's driving people is that sort of social obligation. Whether they feel rude or not, my guess is that they'll feel less rude to not talk to the machine. So in some sense, it may be with regards to rapport, you might imagine the effect would be somewhat opposite. So there's really two social effects that are going on here. One is this rapport is kind of a social effect and these obligations to answer. And you would predict that that would actually be weaker if it's a machine. On the other hand, this fear of being judged will be also weaker with the machine. And one will make you talk less, one will make you talk more. So there's a bunch of stuff going on in here, which I kind of glossed over. But at least the way we set it up right now, there seems to be a benefit to framing it as a machine. And so, but I think you're right that is what's making people talk more than I think there's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's that the agent does follow-up questions. It's really trying to get you to do stuff, and it's showing all the kind of conversational norms. And so all that, I think, just naturally fall into blah, blah, blah. And people they feel like they're being listened to. And a lot of times you have to kick the guys out of the room. It's just going on and on. They'll get another person coming. And a lot of them have just never talked about this stuff. And so it's this kind of non-judgmental listener that they feel like they can just talk, and it doesn't give a lot of evaluative feedback because it doesn't really know what you're saying. And so a lot of the feedback is very neutral, which is actually, in retrospect, was probably a very good thing. Yeah.
Can I follow up on that point? Do you think that and following up on Sarah's question about using this like actual therapy, but it's for screening, do you see the possibility that this could be like a treatment of its own because it is this non-judging thing if you had people come back again and again and again, essentially just talking to this non-judgmental?
Yeah. We have an R21 that she's starting up that's exactly doing that. So they're going to come in, repeated measures over multiple sessions, and this is in the context of pain patients, but we have some biomarkers too. We're trying to look at things like cortisol to see if there's like a stress reduction effect of doing these repeated self-disclosures. It's kind of motivated by work by Jamie Pennybaker on journaling. So just the act of writing out your emotions seems to have a beneficial impact. So if this thing can get you to talk about your emotions, maybe that will have the same kind of effect.
Thinking about situations in which humans are disclosing to other people, sometimes even in therapy contexts. Throughout your talk, I was thinking of like confession and sort of traditional psychotherapy where the therapist is sitting behind the person on the couch. Does that amount of psychological distance from an actual person produce a similar effect that you get with an actual just non-person?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I don't know the literature, but in negotiation contexts, so I've done a lot of work. I didn't talk about on negotiation, and there, seeing the other person can have very different effects depending on if you're in a cooperative context, it actually helps a lot to see the other person. If you're in a competitive context, it actually hurts a lot to see the other person. That's why they do shuttle diplomacy and try to, because you get these escalatory spirals. You see, you react negatively, you see the other person react negatively to you. And so there are a number of social contexts where there's a benefit to breaking the synchrony between people. And I think it really depends on the situation, and it may well be the case. I mean, now I'm going to probably try to see if someone's done that. I mean, there's been some work. One of the things that's new out is this idea of text therapy. There's like Talkspace, I think, is a company that does this stuff. And my understanding is that they have a little bit of data that suggests that people are more comfortable and disclose more to text chat with their therapist than in. I don't know how good that work is, but that's along the lines of what you're saying.
Just a follow-up question to that, is David's question as well as the one regarding demographics. I'd be curious. So we have certain built-up assumptions about how machines work just from our day-to-day experiences with machines. But as you demonstrated here, we will be progressing this into new and different forms as time goes on.
Yeah.
That's got to have a drastic effect on how we'll be approaching these machines in the future.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you can get some insight on that by asking people, for instance, do they play video games regularly? Do they have interactions with a lot of different virtual avatars
potentially represent people or not?
Yeah, we do ask some kind of basic familiarity with technology. I don't recall publishing a paper on that, so my guess is we're not seeing that effect. But I mean, I forget what, there's a book I recently read, I think it's Sarah Kiesler who does a lot of stuff on HCI, and she was talking about how, you know, things that were true 20 years ago in terms of people's folk theories of what, you know, would they use a machine to do this, that, or whatever, it's totally different now. And so our experience is changing our folk theories, and our folk theories drive was part of what this talk is arguing. So yeah, I think, you know, it'll probably become normal to think, you know, worry about hurting your machine's feelings and things like that at some point. And so really, I think it's very fluid. And even like there's some studies about privacy where people, if you ask people in the abstract, you know, how important is privacy? Oh, very important. And then you give them 5 minutes with a cool device that does something, and they're just blasting all their information out to it. So a lot of our cognition is sort of situated and informed by, you know, what our experience.
Very quick question, because it's a direct follow-up on this idea Morgan brought up. I'm sure you've gotten this possible objection or deflation question before. To what extent in this particular time, as technology is emerging, could some of the effects of AI over human be explained by something like, whoa, novelty, I want to hang in this conversation because it's so cool. This thing seems human, but I know it's not. I mean, I don't know to what extent that would be a problematic interpretation, but have you measured people's like self-reported cool factor, novelty, etc.?
Well, we haven't done too much over time stuff. My intuition is you're absolutely right, and there have been a few studies that would suggest, I mean, so one of the criticisms of Cliff Nass's work is that, and this I think comes from Sarah Kiesler, you know, that walks like a duck and talks like a duck, you know, treat it like a duck until you figure out better. And then she would argue that once you get your schema of what this thing really is, you know, then you'll treat it as it is. And right now you're just, I don't know what this is, so let me just treat it a little different in your argument. You're saying, oh, this is cool. So my guess is a lot of the things we're observing are ephemeral, in that as one establishes a longer relationship with the artifact, the initial aspects of it will, you know, whether it looks uncanny or whatever, will be less important. And really what's going to be important is, you know, how the interaction evolves, and does it, you know, because a lot of the stuff with part of the way I describe some of these effects with anthropomorphism is you're really putting lipstick on a pig, and then once if the pig doesn't do something appropriate with the lipstick, you're going to ignore that over time. So another example is, you know, a lot of technology will say, I'm sorry, when it makes a mistake, and then it makes the exact same mistake again. So the machine, in some sense, is not sorry. It's using it's asserting a social intention that I will do better in the future. And so what you will find is people tune out machines saying they're sorry until the machine really is sorry and changes its behavior, and then you understand that there's actually that statement had an effect. And so I think that it gets to the idea of affordances. The machine needs to communicate through its behavior what it is doing. And when we use human-like appearance or human-like utterances that really have a function, but we separate the function from that thing, then it's going to be a short-term effect. It may work, but if we can really make them, quote-unquote, have emotion, have apologies in a real sense, then I think they'll be persistent effects that influence over time.
I agree, but so you have yet to do longitudinal work on this, but that's sort of where you'd go.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, I have two questions. One simple. With the machine learning, the interaction patterns that you were showing,
yeah.
Have you ever tried to do that? So you're doing a longitudinal study next where you actually are tailoring it based on the participants' interaction patterns rather than just like the average interaction patterns?
No, but that would be awesome.
Okay. My other question is,
so let's say one thing we are, I mean, we do try to do certain kind of personalization. Part of what we're doing with the negotiation framework, we're not attuning to people per se, but we're trying to discover, something about what they do wrong, and then the machine adjusts to try to give them more opportunity to make mistakes. And so we are trying to make machines in some sense pick up some idiosyncratic aspects of the person and use that effectively in the interaction. We haven't looked, there are colleagues, there are research projects that try to do entrainment and various kinds of, adapting speech rate. You can even imagine morphing the face of the character over time to be more like you, right? These kind of entrainment effects have been shown to produce more fluent interactions. So there is work on that. I haven't personally done.
And then a broader question. If thinking about things like public health issues and health psychology, there's a big push to make doctors more empathic, like more human.
Yeah.
And your research in some ways is almost advocating the opposite. Like people are interacting better in terms of, and this is particular with disclosure. Patients disclose more to more empathic doctors is the evidence.
Yeah.
And thus they have better treatment outcomes because they tell the doctor more information. But your work is almost going in the opposite direction, where if we actually make the doctor into a robot and dehumanize them slightly, we can get the patients to disclose more and ideally have better health outcomes. So have you thought about how to reconcile those things?
I haven't thought of that specifically. I think also a lot of the concern with the doctors is they're not showing empathy to the patient.
Right, they're cold.
And so they're doing certain things to the patient that are empathetic, like causing more pain or so there is a literature on dehumanization that shows that doctors do mechanistically dehumanize their patients, and that actually helps them cut up into them and leads them to prescribe less opioids, which actually now in retrospect is a good thing perhaps. But no, that's I've not heard anyone make that argument. I'm not sure if a doctor could pull that off. So I think what we would argue rather is they should have this other support thing they would talk to that might help feed information to the doctor. We do, part of another projects I'm involved in, we have these virtual patients which are designed exactly to teach doctors to be more empathetic. So I hadn't really put those two things together until you mentioned it. But yeah, it's a really twisted question to think about that.
Okay, well, I guess that's a good place to leave it, so let's thank our speaker.